non zesfenu medenolo sulupu prosoligon estitosen totelos ochronos.
So in this video we'll explore the pre-Socratic philosophers Parmenides and Zeno, both from the city of Elea. Again, our temporal focus is around the archaic to classical periods in ancient Greece, and in sequence we'll talk about the city of Elea itself quite briefly, then Parmenides and his life, and Zeno and his life, as well as his paradoxes. In themes, we'll spend a little time exploring the distinction between reality and the appearances that can be our guide to it. We'll look at the distinction in Greek between insight or awareness, that's nous, and sense perception, what we see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. That's aesthesis, where we get our word aesthetics in English. We'll also look at the nature of eternity for Parmenides and time, and whether temporal passage or change in time is real. And again, we're looking at three closely related philosophers in this part of our series, Heraclitus, Parmenides, and Empedocles, and though it's a real oversimplification of each one, we can sum them up in slogans in a way as a place to start. For Heraclitus, in a sense, everything changes, and perspectives are relative to the observer. For Parmenides, in a different way, nothing changes, when we really get to the reality underlying appearances. And for Empedocles, as we'll see, some things change, while some things stay the same. So we're moving here to Italy, to Magna Graecia again, to a philosopher for whom the most important idea is a stable one, isness, or reality, esti. In our map again, if we try to situate ourselves in space, we're quite close to Croton in Italy. That is where the Pythagoreans settled, and indeed there's some relation between Parmenides and the Pythagoreans. Elea you can still see today in the modern Italian city in Campania. There's a good deal of archaeological evidence to give us a sense of the city, and elegantly, you can still see the main road of Elea, and I say elegantly because roads and paths are really important in Parmenides' thought, as we'll see. A little bit about the city. This is another of the Greek colonies that constituted in southern Italy Magna Graecia. It was founded in the year 545, we think, by Greeks coming from Ionia, that is the region in Anatolia we've spent a lot of time with as well, during a siege from the Persian Empire. Those Greeks might have been joined by the philosopher Xenophanes, who we've talked about before as well. And Elea, of course, is famous for a whole school of philosophy that takes its name from the city, the Eleatics, or Dialectical school, although there's other dialectical schools as well, in this case most associated with Parmenides and Zeno. So let's talk a bit about Parmenides' life and his main ideas. His name, by the way, Parmenides, means the one who stands by the side, perhaps stands by your side. So there's a notion in his name very appropriately of stability, menein, staying the same. He was born, we think, about 515 and lived through the 450s. This is partly an inference from Plato's dialogue called the Parmenides, where he meets a young Socrates. According to the biographer Diogenes Laertius, drawing on some earlier sources, Parmenides studied perhaps with Xenophanes, who again you might remember could have come with the colony to Elea, or Anaximander, who we talked about in the discussion of Miletus, but his real sympathies were with the Pythagoreans. So Parmenides studied under a relatively poor Pythagorean philosopher named Amenias, and he built him a hero's shrine. It was under his influence, says Diogenes Laertius, that Parmenides was persuaded to adopt a contemplative life. In Plato's dialogue, the Parmenides, it's an elderly Parmenides who travels with his student Zeno to Athens and gets engaged in philosophical conversation with a very young Socrates around the late 450s and introduces him to Eleatic methods of dialectic. This might be dramatic license, we don't know if this meeting ever occurred, but it does reflect Plato's strong respect, even reverence for Parmenides, as well as the recognition of some Pythagorean associations in Parmenides' thought, which is implicit in Aristotle's report of Plato's philosophical development in the Metaphysics 1.6. Parmenides wrote in verse or poetry, just like Hesiod, Xenophanes, and Empedocles did. And you can contrast here Heraclitus, who wrote aphorisms in prose. So we could introduce Parmenides maybe best through some of this poetry. The mares that bear me as far as my heart or thumos ever yearned, he writes, were escorting me then, when they brought me on the celebrated path of the daimon, which brings a knowing mortal to every city one by one. And a little later, the goddess received me kindly. She took my right hand in her own, and she said, "It is right that you learn everything, both the unshakable heart of truth that convinces fully, and the views or opinions, doxai, of mortals in which there is no real trust. But still you'll learn this too, how it is that appearances have to seem credible, penetrating everything through and through." So a few thoughts about this beautiful passage. One is that it offers a divine revelation by a goddess, which is allied with a convincing argument. So here we have something of the sense of divine revelation we met with Hesiod, allied in this case with argumentation or logos, as we'll see. Another important point is the strong contrast that's drawn between reality and appearance. If you think back to our discussion of Heraclitus, we saw that the different appearances or beliefs or doxai of human beings subordinated to divine wisdom, all these different human beliefs can be seen in a way as something we need to diagnose as a puzzle. If we all disagree, how could we all be right? Parmenides is also interested in this problem, as we can see in the poem. There's no real trust in the doxai, the opinions or views of mortals. Nonetheless, we have to recognize that we live with these appearances, they have to seem credible, and it is possible for us somehow to directly access the truth apart from these opinions, even if it can only be expressed or articulated in some kind of attenuated way. So to understand a little more what Parmenides might mean in this contrast between appearance and reality, I'd like to invite us to do a little Parmenidean thought experiment. And to help with this, I'd like to introduce a few Greek psychological ideas and terms. So first of all, these are terms as they're interpreted in somewhat later Platonist philosophy, where they're worked out a bit systematically. But this is hopefully just going to give us a sense for how philosophers in the 5th and 4th centuries would use some of these verbs. First, in the verbal form knowing, which is in a noun, a faculty called nous, or a process called noesis. This can mean a whole range of things in Greek literature and philosophy, like being aware, apprehending, grasping, noticing something as meaningful or having an intention. And even going back in literature to Homer, again, we have this notion that a hero spotting another hero on the battlefield as significant, as meaningful or salient to them, might knowing that hero. So that's one kind of psychological term to think about, this basic sort of awareness of something as significant or understanding or apprehension of it. Then another important set of verbs and nouns is aisthanesthai or aisthesis, where we get the word aesthetic. This can mean especially perception by sense, so seeing, touching, tasting, hearing, and smelling. Then we have dokein and related words which have to do with how things appear or the beliefs that we hold. Sometimes later Greek philosophers will use fantasia and related verbs, where we get words like fantasy in English to pick this up. So appearance or representation, and often in a more kind of constructed way, belief. And lastly, logismos, which is related to logos. As we know, logos can mean a whole range of things too, meaning, speech, pattern. In this case, logismos usually means a process of reasoning, of logosing things through. That can include kind of discursive or sequential thought, like a logical process of reason, or reflective thought that's really cognitive. So if we think of these together, I'm going to focus more on knowing to help with the Parmenidean context we're in here, because it's an important word to Parmenides. Knowing can mean for him something maybe like basic experience or fundamental awareness, which is more elementary than any of these other modes of perceiving. So that is logismos, doxa, and aisthesis, reasoning, appearance, belief, sense perception. They all in a way come to nous. as the basic substrate of experience. All of these are kinds of experience. We can experience emotions, we can experience observations through a telescope or a microscope, we can experience conversations, we can experience thoughts, we can experience music, anything that we experience through any of these channels. If we experience it, if it shows up for us as an object of awareness, that's nousing it, or at least that's the concept I'm going to work with for the next few moments. This comes up in a way as one interpretation of the famous third fragment of Parmenides. It's one and the same for nous and for being, or something a little like that. It's a bit more literally, it's one and the same thing maybe, or just one and the same to engage in noesis or knowing and to exist, which could mean that it's the same subject that is aware and existent, or it could mean, as it's often taken, that somehow the object of basic experience just is. So what it is to be an object of nous. In any case, what I'm going to work with here is the idea of nous as basic experience, whatever channel it comes through. And that takes us to this Parmenidean thought experiment. So I'd like to ask you to take a moment to try to picture, or in a way have an apprehension of nothing. And we'll just take a moment here together. What would it be like to picture or envisage nothing? You might close your eyes. Take a moment to think, imagine, lots of different channels we could use. Okay, so what did we come up with? Sometimes, for example, it's just black space, sometimes white space, sometimes soothing image, sometimes it can be something that's pleasant. But whatever we imagine or come up with or picture, again, it could be sounds, it could be sights, usually it's something. It could be a color again, it could be the absence of color, but there seems to be something there that we're projecting when we try to picture nothing. At least this seems to be part of Parmenides' intuition. He thinks that we're mistaken in imagining that we can picture, conceptualize, or describe nothing. It's always something. And this is going to be an important turning point in his philosophy, and it takes us back to the idea of nous, or experience. Because for him, it's not just a matter of perception, of articulation, of picturing a representation. There is no way to experience nothing, no way to understand nothing, no way to grasp nothing. So let's see how this works out in the texts. The metaphor of the path is important in Parmenides' notion of noesis. And I'm using lots of different translations for noesis here to convey its different meanings. In this case, I'm going to use insight or understanding, but again, remembering it can mean something like a basic experience as well. So come, says Parmenides, I'll tell you myself, remembering this is actually the voice of the goddess speaking to him as the persona in the poem. And you, carry this mythos or story safe once you've heard it. Which ones are the only paths, hodoi, of inquiry for noesis? Here is the one. That is, st. There's not even a subject for the verb here. It's not it is or that is, just is. And is not is impossible. This is the path of conviction, patho, or convincingness, because it attends the truth. So that's one path. That is. The other path, that is not, and that is not must be, that I declare to you to be a path that is utterly impossible to discover. Because you can't know what isn't, meon in Greek, since that's impossible. Nor could you declare it or point it out. Because, and this is that third fragment again, it's one and the same for seeing and being. If we used seeing and insight in this kind of visual vocabulary for noesis, in Greek it's tagar auton noein estin to kai enai. It's the same noein, to have noesis, to understand, have insight, experience, awareness, however we translate that, and to be. So underneath that we've got this idea that because noein and enai, experiencing and being, let's say, are one in some sense, Therefore, it's impossible to experience, conceptualize, be aware of notness, of is not. If we think of these as paths of inquiry, is not is just impossible to access, but is possible to access. Is can be, let's say again with our different translations, seen with the mind or experienced, however we translate knowing, and is not cannot be seen with the mind or experienced. And this basic distinction is fundamental for Parmenides. It applies right across the board to all experience. Whatever other categories we engage with, big and small, true and false, sensory and non-sensory, in a way, it all comes down to this fundamental point that we cannot engage with non-being. And I'd again just remind us that the being that we're talking about is not something exactly for Parmenides, but it is, or in Greek, esti. So there's a lot of interpretive challenges here. I'm just going to add one more extra element. Parmenides is a bit more specific in laying out not just two but maybe three paths. On the one hand, we must say and think that what is, for it's there to be. It's just as fascinating in Greek as it is in English. This can also be translated as it's possible for it to be. But nothing isn't, made in Dugestin. Just this is what I tell you to meditate on, says the goddess to Parmenides. For such is the road of inquiry that I hold you back from. So far that's pretty clear. So that's one of the ways. Is. We can access that. Experience can engage with is. On the other hand, is not. No way, we can't engage with that. But then there's another path. So here's our third one. Then too from this one, that which mortals understanding nothing mold or fashion platysthai, two-headed they are, for the helplessness in their breast guides their wandering thought, and they're carried along. This is the way of mortal opinion or doxa. Deaf and blind too, peoples without judgment who imagine this is and is not, is the same, and not the same. So two-headed in the sense of yes and no about things at the same time. Is and is not. These are people who don't see that the path of is not is unavailable. And that of all things, the path turns back again. This might be a reference to Heraclitus because this word palintropos, backstretched or turning back again, is a component of his idea of the harmony or tuning that is backstretched or turns back again. So to summarize, we've got three ways of inquiry here in fragment 2 and 8. The way of truth, esti, it just experience is. The way that cannot be traveled is not. Try to think of nothing and you're always thinking of something. There's an is there, or at least that's a way of interpreting it. And then the way of opinion or doxa, or seeming or appearance. This is the views of mortals which blend both. I think we could give a few examples of how it's the case that in mortal opinion there's, on Parmenides' view, a kind of illegitimate blend of yes and no, of the smuggling in of thinking of nothing to form doxa, or opinion, or ordinary views, where all we can really access is the truth, esti, which we'll talk about in a moment too. So here's a possible construal. This is one place to start, but as Parmenides says, it's common to me from where to begin, because that's where I'm going to arrive back again, as we'll see. So any positive attribution on one reading of Parmenides, if it's true, would have to negate another one. And just to see what we're talking about, I could say, it's here, and that might seem to necessarily imply the negation of it being there. So if it's here, it's not there. If it's tall, it's not short. If it's green, it's not red. If it's in the past, it's not now. At least that's one way to interpret one of the building blocks of his idea. But, on Parmenides' view, the negation is impossible. So it's actually not as legitimate as it seems to say it's not there, it's not short, it's not red, it's not now. Why is that? Well, because is not is unthinkable and inexpressible. So for Parmenides, even our ordinary, what philosophers sometimes call, after Aristotle, predicative uses of the word is, to say things like is there, is short, is red, or is now, rely on a deeper kind of underlying existential use of is, exists. And on Parmenides' view, which is quite bold and surprising, because we can't use is not in an existential sense because there's nothing there, so to speak. If we try to think of nothing, it turns out we're always thinking of something, the way of experiencing or asserting nothing is impassable. So we're actually mistaken when we think we can use is-not statements. It might appear that way with doxa. It might even to sense perception appear as if there's nots, but there aren't. There is no such thing as a not. So the second half of those implications are simply impossible, as non-commonsensical as that might seem. And further, this would imply that the positive assertion must also be impossible. So in the formula of propositional logic that the Stoics in Latin would call modus tollens, as we've inherited this kind of logic, if one thing implies another necessarily, and that other thing is false, then the first thing must be false too. And that's sort of the idea here. If it is here to be true requires that it is not there, and if that second thing can't be true, then it's here must also be false. So all these assertions actually fail in a strict sense. It's not here and it's not there, and it's not, because we can't use not. So they're merely appearances. In reality, none of these negations nor their positive binary halves can be true. Now that kind of seems silly in a way, because even if it's an interesting idea, that sure doesn't seem to be what we experience. It seems like I can move from here to there. I can think of past, present, and future as distinct. Parmenides acknowledges that, but for him, it's a matter of appearance or doxa. These attributions seem real, but it's a matter of mortal opinion, as he would put it. And he acknowledges, the goddess speaking to him stresses, in fact, that he'll see why these appearances must seem true, but they're not actually true. All we can really know as truth about a subject is SD. In this sense, not as a binary opposition or a construction, just is. So what does that mean? This is a whole other mystery. Let's think a little bit about this word SD for Parmenides and how it's been interpreted. Here's a few different readings that have been offered since antiquity of what he might mean. First, there's a strict monist reading, as it's sometimes called. So suppose I'm trying to point something out, or it's available to Nous. I have an object of experience, and I'm trying to talk about it, think about it, engage with it somehow. Then what Parmenides means by SD about it is that whatever I'm pointing out or experiencing is the same thing as everything else I'm pointing out and experiencing. Everything is one and the same in some sense. This is an interesting reading. It's also very bold, but Parmenides' view might be more subtle. At least Aristotle seems to contrast his position, as Aristotle understands it, with more straightforward forms of strict monism. So here's a few other options too we can explore in complement to that one. On the sometimes called logical dialectical reading, what Parmenides means is that anything I point out or experience must exist, must really be there. This is a reading that the celebrated ancient philosopher Owen suggested in an article in 1960, Eleatic Questions, and drew inspiration from comments by Bertrand Russell. As Russell put it, when you think of something. When you use a name, it must be the name of something. Therefore, both thought and language require objects outside themselves. And since you can think of a thing or speak of it at one time as well as another, whatever can be thought of or spoken of must exist at all times. Consequently, there can be no change, since change consists in things coming into being or ceasing to be. So in this sense, again, what Parmenides means by saying the way of truth just discloses SD is that whatever I encounter, it's real. In some sense, in some way. Then we can talk more about, in terms of opinion and appearance, how it's real, but there's no non-beings there for me to experience and encounter. Then again, there's the essentialist reading. This develops especially in the 1970s and 80s in modern scholarship with scholars like Alexander Mourlatos, and it's actually quite close to the reading that Aristotle seems to take of Parmenides. On this reading, Parmenides is saying that whatever you're pointing out or encountering just is exactly what it is, in its essence, not in its accidental or sort of non-essential features. So there's a notion of what's sometimes called essentialism here. On this view, Parmenides uses a special sense of the verb einai, or to be, which Mourlatos calls the is of speculative predication, to speak of what it really is, a thing's nature or essence. And again, with Aristotle, this means that Parmenides is talking about what something really is without focusing on differentiating its accidental features. So, for example, about me, you could say Michael SD, just Michael, apart from all these other things about me that you could take away and I would still be here. You could take away, perhaps, my size, my height, my location, whether I'm in this place. You could take away whether I'm giving this lecture right now. You could take away all kinds of different features and still leave the Michaelness of me here. And then Parmenides' point would be that Michaelness, that fundamental, essential character, let's say, is the only thing that really can be said about me. If you encounter someone else, you might judge them in terms of their qualities or apparent features. But in the end, you should set all that aside and recognize that they just are who they are in an irreducible and unique way. So that's a really interesting reading too. All of these readings can shed light on that famous line in B2 and B3, which culminates in B3, the same for noein, awareness, experience, understanding, and enai, or being. So they all shed light on what experience is like, and how Parmenides is trying to bring it down to foundations. There's an interesting implication of many of these readings for Parmenides' view of time, which many of his successors picked up. So, for example, in the 8th fragment, Parmenides says, there only remains the muthos, the story of the path that is, SD. On this path, there are signs, so many of them, that being is not generated, cannot be destroyed, is complete, single-born, untrembling, unending, and was not, nor will it be at some time, since it is now together whole. So what does this mean? There's a number of philosophical positions that have been associated with the interpretation of this aspect of Parmenides' view. One is what today we sometimes call eternalism, the view that all points in time are equally real, although Parmenides' view is a little different because he seems to be emphasizing maybe the eternal now, that now is the most licit way to speak of eternity or time in a way of reality, and the past and the future are not necessarily in the same way, and yet, from his point of view, we can't think of things in the past or future as not. Somehow, everything is now, even what appears to us to be past or future. So that's a pretty radical idea too. A pretty popular interpretation of Parmenides is he's an early four-dimensionalist. So he's got a kind of block universe theory. For him, time persistence is like space extension, and each of us have, in a way, temporal parts. So that is to say, in reality, Michael is a four-dimensional being, let's say. My past self, present self, and future self are all parts of this space-time four-dimensional entity that I really am. In reality, then, this is what Parmenides means when he speaks of the eternal now, and this is a little like how Plato seems to interpret his talk of the aion, or eternity. I, the four-dimensional whole Michael across all of time, am now together whole, all at once. The sense of temporal passage, that there's a difference between yesterday, today, and tomorrow, is psychological then. It's a matter of experience in the sense of doxa, or appearance. But in reality, if I really get down to the foundation with Nous, I'll see that it's all at once. That I'm really this eternal four-dimensional being. So that's a fascinating reading of Parmenides as well. I showed an image of a light cone in the last picture because in some ways this picks up ideas that have also flourished in the 20th century. In Albert Einstein's famous and later letter to the family of a colleague, now he's departed from this strange world a little ahead of me, but that means nothing. For us believing physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only an illusion, if a stubbornly persistent one. So that's a very Parmenidean idea read in that light. So, summarizing a few of these points with respect to mortal opinions, Parmenides is willing to go beyond, in a way, or say things beyond the way of truth alone. He does countenance mortal opinions that mix is and is not. His point is only that they are illusory. We have to live that way, maybe. We have to recognize these appearances and engage with them. But at a deeper level, we have to see that experience and reality are different. So at one point in his poem he says, "I envy you my reliable account and thought about truth. From here on learn mortal opinions. Learn how humans have established names, constructed labels for things, in this aspect of the world that has to do with doxa or appearance." And he did some interesting work in this area. So Diogenes Laertius reports that Parmenides was the first to declare that the earth is spherical. He held that there were two elements, fire and earth. The former has the role of craftsperson, the latter of material. He argued that human beings proceeded from the sun. From the basic sort of early elements arise heat and cold, which go on to form all other things. So these are views like those of some of the Milesians we've encountered in other philosophers. The point is that for Parmenides, they constitute doxa or appearance. He's not claiming them as true, but he's claiming them as reasonable to believe in the world of uncertainty, doxa, and appearance. But when it comes to truth, all we can say is esti. So here's some takeaways. First, there's a basic underlying intuition or direct awareness we have, nous, that accesses at least this about reality, estin, in some sense, is. And we've seen a little of the different ways that is can be interpreted. Also, partly because of this, at the deepest level of reality, nothing really changes, though it appears to do so. So there's an important distinction between appearance and reality. Thus, in reality, no one has ever gone, or not yet here. It's all in a way in an eternal now. In Greek, ie means always or consistently, and the nominal form ion is the word that's later translated as eternity. Temporal passage, then, the experience of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, is very real to us as a human doxa, an opinion, a persistent one, as Einstein put it, and yet in basic foundation, the cosmos is really all at once, this sort of four-dimensional universe, if we interpret it that way. Notably, that's a different formulation than Parmenides himself might use, but possibly a reasonable way of interpreting the fragments. Again, many of the labels that human beings use, and again thinking back on some of the diversity of opinions that were current in Parmenides' day that Heraclitus engaged with as well, all these kind of oppositions, categories, and labels are constructed or apparent and not real. After thinking about Parmenides' arguments for a while, you might think this is pretty interesting, but you might also feel like it's so at odds with ordinary experience that it's hard to accept. This was how some of Parmenides' critics in his own life and following in later generations of philosophy felt as well. They thought that his view was so far from the ordinary experience or doxa, the way things seem, that it was difficult to accept. And Parmenides' pupil Zeno was particularly important in responding to some of those critics. So we'll take a little bit of time to think about Zeno as well. Zeno was a pupil of Parmenides. He also was a native of the city of Elea. His name literally is related to Zeus, and Zeus's name etymologically is related with life, or zoe. So he's the one who's lively or Zeusian. He was born about 490 BC, a little later than Parmenides, so he would have been a young man when he was a pupil of Parmenides. There's a character, Zeno, in Plato's dialogue, the Parmenides, who's based on the historical figure, and the character, according to Plato, describes his book as a response to Parmenides' critics. Specifically, they had stressed a kind of contradiction between the esti theory, as powerful and compelling and interesting as it is, and common sense experience. They thought that there's something absurd about a theory that was so distant from ordinary experience. And what Zeno sought to do in the book is to introduce a number of thought experiments that showed there was an absurdity inherent in our ordinary intuitions too, that it's not as sort of cut and dry as it seems, that motion is real, that time passes as we ordinarily think that it does. And Zeno actually spoke of maybe, or wrote about, or was understood to use the notion of the paradoxa, what is beside or apart from ordinary experience or doxa, to do this. So this is one of the sources of our word paradox in English, something that's apart from, or para, the way things seem, or doxa. So we can take a little bit of time to look at a few of Zeno's paradoxes. The first of these is the dichotomy, which is from dikos, double or twofold, and temein in Greek, which is to cut. So to cut in two. The reason it's called a cut in two is because it relies on the idea of infinite divisibility of space and time. Suppose I want to get from point A to point B. I need to cross halfway first. That halfway mark is halfway between point A and B. Let's call it C. But to get to C, I'm going to have to get halfway to C again. Let's call that D. And to get to D, I'm going to get halfway, let's call it E, and so on. So in order to get to point B, I'm going to get half of the way first, then a quarter, an eighth, a 16th, a 32nd, a 64th, and it keeps on going. This is a notion we're pretty familiar with today through limits in calculus. So to sum this up, as Aristotle does in his Physics, Book 6, Chapter 9, it seems as if it's impossible to traverse infinite points in finite time. So motion, if it's conceived as crossing a finite series of points, or let's say even an infinite series of points between two set locations, can't really work the way it appears to. So this is a kind of, it's sometimes called reductio ad absurdum, to absurdity of what seems like a very ordinary common sense idea, that we move by crossing a number of points in arriving at our destination. According to Zeno, it can't work that way because otherwise we'd reach the absurdity of the dichotomy paradox. Another paradox that's pretty famous is the Achilles, and it works on a similar kind of principle. Here's Achilles, he's the fastest warrior in the Greek army at Troy, and here's a turtle. Achilles is a little faster than the turtle, but the turtle gets a head start in a race. And at every sort of moment or increment of time, Achilles covers a lot of ground and the turtle covers a little bit of ground. So the question is, when will Achilles catch up to the turtle and pass the turtle? Shouldn't take that long, right? Well, Zeno's argument is that with every increment of time, just as Achilles covers lots of ground to catch up to where the turtle was, even a little bit, the turtle will move slightly forward. So there's no point in time at which Achilles will pass the turtle. Again, this kind of assumes infinite divisibility of both space and time, but with that assumption, it seems at least plausible, and it's really interested people to figure out, like, where's the problem in that reasoning. One more of these paradoxa, or kind of counter-appearance stories, is about an arrow, which can be fired from a bow, sort of a typical example. And to sum it up briefly, at any moment when the arrow is in flight, in that very instant, if there is a sort of instant of time, the arrow is not in motion. If that's true, then no matter how many of these instants we stack up next to each other, the arrow is never in motion. It's just lots of static snapshots. So you could kind of think of this like a movie. You know how we might play a movie at 30 frames a second, 60 frames a second. We get the illusion that there's motion, but actually it's a sequence of static moments. You could also think of this in terms of the block universe theory, or four-dimensionalism about space and time, sometimes attributed to Parmenides in some form. So on Parmenides' view too, in reality maybe, there's this sort of four-dimensional reality of past, present, and future, all at once in a way, a kind of always now, or at least it imitates or reflects an always now. We have the experience that there's motion, that the arrow is flying from one place to another, but really it's all true at once. So all of these examples in a way could be seen as Zeno trying to show some absurdity, not necessarily in the fact of motion, presumably Zeno was able to get from one place to another, but in the ordinary intuitions that might have been employed by Parmenides' critics, trying to show that their expectations and their doxai, too, relied on some problematic assumptions. We can notice that a lot of these paradoxes depend on infinite divisibility, and that tended to encourage later philosophers to think about what would happen if you posited indivisible units of space and time. They called these atoma, or uncuttables, in response to dichotomy or temein, that language of cutting or consistently dividing. And of course we get our word atom from this development of the theory of atoma, or uncuttables in later Greek thought. Another thought we can bring to bear with Zeno's paradoxes is their influence in Newton and Leibniz's effort to develop the calculus, as we call it today, to work with these kinds of limit scenarios or asymptotes. In fact, it might seem as if Newton and Leibniz solved Zeno's paradoxes by introducing modeling through calculus, although many have responded that it's not exactly the case, and Zeno's concern wasn't that it was impossible to model or predict this kind of motion, So he would be quite happy with a mathematical model that could do that. It was rather a question about whether that's actually what happens. Do infinitely many non-overlapping intervals really occur within finite time? And that has led some physicists like Max Planck to think as well about whether we need to posit an actual or physical limit to divisibility in space or time, like Planck lengths and Planck time. It's also led to developing thoughts about four-dimensionalism, about, as Einstein would put it, space-time. So while these are very different ideas in a way from very different philosophical and scientific contexts, there's a real interest in exploring how Parmenides develops this radically, fundamentally different picture of the universe and cosmos and how it influenced his contemporaries and successors. So let's sum up briefly. We've talked a bit about the city of Elea, we've talked about Parmenides and Zeno as personalities, and we've explored some of these themes, reality and appearance, and how Parmenides encourages us to try to see the reality esti is. We've looked at some of the psychological terminology and notions that seem to come into play. For example, Nous as this, we've tried lots of translations, awareness, insight, understanding, thought. On the one hand, basically, at least as I've pitched to you, in Parmenides' thought, a kind of direct experience of being. On the other hand, aesthesis, so sense perception, and also doxa, or appearance, and how things can appear quite differently from how they are. For Parmenides, and perhaps for Zeno too, as for Heraclitus, we can be critical of the many different opinions, views, and appearances that human beings might adopt. At the same time, for Parmenides, we don't need to be skeptical about nous. It's so fundamentally rooted in the experience that we all share in common. In that sense, perhaps it could be compared to Heraclitus' use of logos. And we've also looked at some of the implications of Parmenides' basic view for the possibility of a timeless eternity, and the sense that change, while we might experience it, we might have a sense of change in a more appearance-oriented sense of experience, nonetheless is unreal, that eternity is the truth. So, coming to situating Parmenides in the triad of philosophers we're thinking about right now, we looked at these simplified slogans. For Heraclitus, everything changes, pantare, it's all in flow. For Parmenides, as we've seen, in some sense, nothing really changes. And for Empedocles, who we'll talk about next, some things change and some things stay the same.
No soy